Newton, Massachusetts became its own town in 1688 after being part of Cambridge since 1630. Since the town's founding, its people have been influential in the history of social movements in America due to their progressive mindset and willingness to fight for justice.
The town has participated and advocated for social movements throughout American history, such as abolition, women's rights, gay rights, and environmental movements throughout the 19th and 20th centuries and today.
In the early 19th century, Boston was the center of the abolition movement in New England. In the proximity of the two cities, Boston and Newton, drew many Newtonians to the movement. Many in Newton were part of the Massachusetts Abolition Society and advocated for an end to slavery. There had been a small black population in Newton since the late 18th century, but people were still compelled to help the rest of the country join their efforts. In 1817, John Kendrick published a pamphlet entitled The Horrors of Slavery in Newton, which was a collection of abolitionist essays centered around the colonizationist beliefs. These beliefs were formed from the American Colonization Society, established in 1816, which advocated against slavery but still believed that blacks and whites were fundamentally different races and could not live together. Perhaps a more liberal effort was when William Jackson, a politician born in 1783, offered his home as a stop on the Underground Railroad, risking his personal, political, and financial safety. His father, Major Timothy Jackson, leader of the Temperance Society, built the home, now referred to as the Jackson Homestead, in 1809. Jackson offered food, financial assistance, and shelter to escaped slaves and kept fugitives hidden here in his basement. Much of the work helping the Underground Railroad was undocumented or destroyed in order to assure the safety of all those participating in escaping. However, his daughter Ellen Jackson documented some of these events in the 1890s. Nathaniel T. Allen was also known to have sheltered fugitive slaves in Newton at this time. However, there is very little evidence to prove so. The Jackson homestead was owned by the Jackson family until 1949, when it was given to the city of Newton. The home now serves as the Newton History Museum. The museum not only discusses abolition, but commemorates the 61 men who fought with the Union during the Civil War. And there is a monument in the Newton Cemetery that commemorates them to this day.
Due to the easy access to Newton from Boston, created by some of America's earliest railroads going through Newton, this town has been a commuter suburb since the early 19th century. Due to this, many women in Newton have been daughters and wives of working men rather than independent working women themselves. Many women in Newton have invested most of their time in the progress of social movements and have created women's clubs in each village of Newton, starting in the mid-19th century. These clubs often discussed very progressive topics and were years ahead of their time. Each of the women's clubs was invested in different things. Some were more involved in the betterment of the Newton community, and others were more involved in the social movements affecting the whole country. In 1880, Massachusetts legislature made women eligible to vote, but many women's clubs were still very involved in women's suffrage. The Newton Women's Suffrage League, formed in 1899, later renamed the Newton Equal Suffrage League in 1907, held many protests and wrote many letters to newspapers advocating for universal suffrage. The Newton Equal Suffrage League published this document exemplifying the many reasons all women need the right to vote. They urged women and men to help them secure their right to fulfill their civic duties. These women's clubs wanted to increase the role of women in society and thus created programs to increase educational opportunities for women in the early 20th century. Many women's clubs established scholarships and raised money for girls from Newton to go to university. During difficult times of turmoil in the country, these women's clubs provided support and protested for social reform. During the Great Depression, women's clubs collected and distributed clothes for the poor. Many of their meetings discussed relationships with foreign countries and America's role on the world stage. During World War II, members of these women's clubs sold war stamps and bonds across the town and at schools. They sent clothes to the Newton unit. They adopted 2 children from England. They knit and sewed clothes and other items for soldiers and English children. And due to their efforts, Newton sent 30 pounds of food to Europe during the war. After World War II ended, and more information about America's actions involving nuclear bombs was released, many women's clubs protested the bomb dropping greatly and published many articles about the dangers of a nuclear war. They also protested greatly against war in Vietnam and held many peace protests. The women's clubs in Newton also began the environmental reforms that the town would later see by protesting the Japanese beetle. The Japanese beetle was accidentally brought to the US in the early 20th century and is known for its detrimental effects on crops. The Newton women's groups attempted to create support for the eradication of the beetle and instilled reforms to help Newton's crops and gardens prosper. Newton is now known for being an environmentally aware and green city, and this all began with the reforms implemented in the early 70s. In 1977, the Citizens for Clean Air in Publicly Used Buildings sent out this important message to the citizens of Newton, in which they urged them to stop smoking in public buildings. This notice informed people of the dangers of secondhand smoke inhalation and of the upcoming statewide referendum to vote against smoking in public buildings. In 1971, Newton was the first city in Massachusetts to establish a newspaper recycling program. However, many Newton newspapers in the early 70s published articles such as these about the mayor's hesitation to sign off on recycling programs. The newspaper claimed that Newton should be proud of its program of curbside collection of paper, glass, and cans as one of the pioneering efforts nationwide. By the late 70s, Newtonians were already being prompted to recycle, and notices were being published in order to notify them on how to do it properly. And in 1981, a mandatory paper recycling ordinance was passed. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Newton began to implement the environmental measures and recycling programs still used to this day. In 2005, the citywide educational campaign, "If you can rip it, you can recycle it," was established in order to recycle more paper. In 2006, Green Up Newton, a month-long celebration of Earth Day in April, was established. And in 2009, the city expanded single-stream recycling to be citywide.
In the early 1990s, only a handful of private schools in America had the Gay Straight Alliance. But in 1992, Newton South created the first one in any public school in America. The GSA discussed issues impacting people in the LGBT community. People of all sexual orientations and genders are welcome to join. In 1992, Massachusetts Governor William Weld established a Commission on Gay and Lesbian Youth. This was the first legislation in any U.S. state. On November 18, 2003, the case of Goodridge versus the Department of Public Health was the first case in which a state's highest court found that same-sex couples had the right to marry. The two plaintiffs in the case, Julie and Hillary Goodridge, the first same-sex couples to marry in Massachusetts, lived in Newton. They paved the way for the federal bill that was passed in 2016, allowing all members of the same sex to marry.
Robert Parlin, still a history teacher at Newton South High School to this day, helped create the Gay Straight Alliance in 1992.
Well, things have changed dramatically in the past 25 years. It's really been a sea change where I think the vast majority of Americans do believe that all people should have the same rights. Even the views on same-sex marriage, which back 15 years ago, the vast majority of Americans did not believe in same-sex marriage rights, and now the majority do. So I think we've just gone through a dramatic change, and I think that's because people have come out, young people especially, have talked to their peers and talked to their families and broken down a lot of the stereotypes that made people so fearful and hateful toward LGBT people, and I think that's changed everything. For me, the big issue at South was coming out to my students and to the staff, and then that had to happen really before the Gay Straight Alliance, I thought. And I was very fearful because my colleagues had suggested that maybe it wasn't a place where it would be safe. When I got here in the mid-'80s, there was no talk whatsoever about LGBTQ issues. So I was aware through working with other teachers, particularly at Concord Academy and Phillips Academy Andover, where the first two Gay Straight Alliances were. I was aware that they had started up Gay Straight Alliances and they'd been really successful, and that students had really wanted to be social justice activists, and they thought this was kind of the big cause of their time, of their generation. So I knew there'd be support, and there was a senior here, a kid named Matt Flynn, who also came to me and talked to me about what was going on in other schools. These were all independent schools, and he said, what could we do at South? And I suggested, what about thinking about a Gay Straight Alliance? There's a lot of homophobia, and I saw that here in the hallways, and I saw there was no support seemingly for students before the GSA started. So I decided I wanted to be a part of changing that. So in the end, I ignored my department chair, my fellow colleagues who suggested that maybe it wouldn't be an appropriate time, and I decided to come out. And I had no negative experiences. There were a few parents who were uncomfortable with the idea that sex in any form was being talked about in the classroom, but I explained to them that I wanted to provide a role model for my students, someone who's happy and healthy, and I wanted students to see that there were LGBT people who were proud about their identity and who were just living normal lives, and so that they could know that it's possible to be happy.
Tuesday, June 6, 2017, in his speech for the 4th annual Pride flag raising at City Hall, Mayor Seti Warren announced the creation of a new position in the Newton government.
Created this position, and the name of this position is a Newton LGBTQ liaison, our first for the city of Newton.
Due to the establishment of Newton as a suburban middle-class town, its people have had the time to participate in many social movements, such as abolition, women's rights, and women's movements, which also supported environmental movements and gay rights. In far more instances than its residents know, the people of Newton have initiated conversations and movements which would end up affecting the nation as a whole. Newton's progressive mindset has affected our nation for the better, and the reforms made in Newton have sped up our nation on its route towards being a more progressive, open-minded, and supportive place for all its people.